So Call of Duty is currently being sued and blamed for a tragedy unfairly. A group of parents of victims of the Uvalde tragedy have decided to file a lawsuit against Call of Duty, claiming that the video game is a main driving factor behind events like these. Obviously, most people can agree that this is a stretch. There are tens of millions of people who have played Call of Duty and not gone on to commit atrocities. But for some reason, it seems like time and time again, video games are blamed for all sorts of real violence. No one is saying events like this aren't incredibly tragic, but to throw blame on a video game for the events of that day is simply unfair. But why is it that video games are constantly being blamed for events like this? It isn't the first time a group of parents have gotten together to try to file a lawsuit against game producers, claiming that they inspired the perpetrator. Today on Poseidon Films, we investigate the phenomenon of parents attempting to put a majority of blame for tragedies squarely in the hands of Call of Duty and similar games, hopefully to find out why this trend continues and if there is anything that can be done to stop it. Before we get into the video, I want to make it abundantly clear that I feel immense sympathy for the parents of the Uvalde tragedy. None of us can imagine what it is like to lose a child to such a heinous act. This video is in no way attempting to downplay what they went through or make it seem like what occurred isn't anything short of horrible. However, I do feel like blaming Call of Duty for this event is unfair. After all, millions of people around the world are able to enjoy these titles without becoming unhinged individuals capable of what occurred that day. The lawsuit itself we'll be discussing today was filed in May of this year. The main premise of the suit claims that the game Call of Duty was responsible for exposing the perpetrator to weapons, and framed those weapons as a tool to solve problems instead of something used for violence. Essentially meaning that the lawyer argues that without Call of Duty, none of this would have occurred in the first place. They think that Activision plays an active role in conditioning unstable individuals to use weapons, and that without these titles, these acts would never take place. Before getting into the science that disproves this claim entirely, I want to take it at face value and explain why it doesn't really make sense, especially in American culture. Call of Duty is a cultural phenomenon. No one can deny that. However, in a country where guns outnumber people by a few million, it's outrageous to think that without Call of Duty, people wouldn't know that weapons exist. Even a small peruse of Netflix shows dozens of movies and TV shows blatantly displaying the same weapons from Call of Duty. Beyond that, walking into sporting goods stores across the nation also would expose you to the same objects. There really is no way to consume any modern media of any type without being exposed to similar themes at some point. Under this lawsuit's logic, they should also be filing suit against Marvel for making Black Widow and exposing people to weapons. Not to mention, just because you've seen something before does not mean you suddenly become someone capable of perpetuating mass violence. I have played video games like Call of Duty for nearly a decade now, and I can assure you that doing anything similar to Uvalde has never even crossed my mind. There are literally hundreds of millions of people in the United States that consume media that fits this lawsuit's narrative that never go on to be violent in their entire life. Shifting the blame for a truly unhinged, psychotic individual onto the back of an innocent pastime just seems unfair. Activision's response to the lawsuit, I think, sums it up nicely. Activision called the Uvalde tragedy horrendous and heartbreaking in every way, and we express our deepest sympathies to the families and communities who remain impacted by this senseless act of violence. Millions of people around the world enjoy video games without turning to horrific acts. If this lawsuit had any truth to it, then there would be mass amounts of people experiencing an urge to commit violence, and this simply is not the case. Obviously, logic isn't always enough to win in the courtroom, so beyond that, this has been studied many times by people much smarter than myself. A study done by Harvard in 2010 found that there was no discernible link between a consumption of video games and an increase in aggressive behavior. While there have been some studies that have claimed to discover a link between these two, there is a missing link that few supporters are aware of. Most of the studies that claim to have found an increase in violence after video game consumption failed to prove that this increase in aggression ever transitioned into real-world action. Dr. Christopher Ferguson, a psychology professor at Texas A&M, explains that many of the studies that are anti-video game have no proof that they increase real-world aggression. Instead, they rely on measures that are purely observational instead of being able to be measured accurately. It also is important to note that since 1996, there has actually been a huge decrease in violent crime amongst the youth population, This data comes directly from FBI crime data. If online games and games like Call of Duty were actually causing an increase in violence, then this would be the exact opposite case. How would youth violence be on a huge decline over the last 3 decades if apparently online gaming is turning everyone into violent psychopaths? The science is not there to prove that there is any correlation between consuming video games and being a monster. Anyone claiming otherwise is citing studies that cannot actually prove causation. I think it's unfair to paint the millions of people who can enjoy video games peacefully as sleeper agents one Call of Duty loss away from hurting others. I understand that these families are dealing with unimaginable loss, and I understand wanting to look for something to blame, but Call of Duty simply is not at fault for the events of that day. I think a good analogy would be to compare it to a different genre of video games. Street racing has been on an increase in recent years across the country. However, you don't hear anyone clamoring for Forza to be outlaws because it's causing people to go be street racers. For some reason, news agencies are willing to blame games like Call of Duty for violence, but in every other genre of game, people can understand it doesn't bleed over into reality. I also don't want anyone watching this video to think that this is a new phenomenon either. Video games have long been a convenient scapegoat to try to explain away insane individuals. There was a time after the Parkland tragedy where then President Donald Trump attempted to blame horrifically violent video games for that tragedy. And even back in the late 90s, many blamed games like Doom for the incidents that occurred at Columbine. It is popular in the culture to want to find explanations for why these things happen, but just because it's popular to say an opinion doesn't make it correct. Psychologically, it makes sense that we as people want to find something to explain why these events occur. It is uncomfortable for people to think that some of those who walk amongst us are monsters who are capable of committing unspeakable acts. It's easier to try to find any reason to explain away their behavior. Not that it's okay, but most people don't want to think that these people commit these tragedies for no reason. It is much easier for people to sleep at night if they have a villain in their head to pin these atrocities onto. The scary reality is that there are people who are just monsters who do not value human life, regardless of whether they play Call of Duty or not. They are deeply disturbed, unstable people. The attempt to blame video games for these people is misguided. And while I'm sure we can all sympathize with wanting an explanation of some sort, it seems unfair to villainize the tens of millions of people worldwide who can partake in this pastime without turning into a worthless monster. The media also tends to play up these accusations in the sake of gathering attention and stirring up emotion. It's a sick reality that news channels make money off the back of tragedy, and anything they can do to sensationalize that further they are willing to do. It makes me sick to my stomach that news organizations are willing to exploit these tragedies for profit. But blaming video games for them is an easy way to sensationalize these events further and garner more attention. You don't have to look far for an example of them doing this in the past. For example, after the Virginia Tech tragedy in 2007, it was widely reported that the perpetrator, who was an absolute coward, was an avid fan of the series Counter-Strike. Certain publications tried to sensationalize this alleged fact by claiming it was a part of the reason he was so radicalized and capable of committing the atrocity. This fact was widely reported, and I'm sure there are still millions of people who associate what happened with this fake fact. The reality is that even the scumbag's roommates say that they had never seen him even play a video game. By the time the truth was revealed and it came out, he had never played video games in the first place. The news stories had been ran, and the public associated video games with a violent menace. I don't really understand why the media has such an obsession with trying to vilify video games. However, when looking at history, we see many common replications of this type of behavior. For example, in the 80s and 90s before the internet boom, movies and music were frequently used as scapegoats to explain society's problems. Look at how many rock bands were interpreted as having secret satanic meanings in their music. And there are still articles archived that discuss how shows like The Wire will accelerate street violence by glorifying it. At this point in history, mainstream media and music have been accepted as parts of culture, but at one point they were rallied against as well. Even dating further back in history, you can see examples of the older generation thinking reading books would cause people to display antisocial behavior. Unfortunately, it seems like most of the time, any technological advancement in entertainment is met with immense protest and frequently used as an excuse to not understand the problems that face the nation. No matter where you look in human history, it seems that there has to be a scapegoat for someone to throw their problems on. No matter how bad people want to point the finger at video games as the culprit for these random acts of violence, it really doesn't make sense to blame these occurrences on things like this. I really do hope the families involved in any of these tragedies mentioned find peace. It isn't something I want to discuss without respecting it. I just think directing the blame in this direction isn't something that makes sense to me at the end of the day. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to press the like button. Let me know what you thought in the comment section down below, and subscribe if you like videos like this. I am trying to hit 10,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I would love to have your help. Check out my last video about the day Overwatch died.